Tears streamed down little Oliver's face as his father, Jason, walked away. No hug, no goodbye, just a cold stare. The 6-year-old boy stood frozen at the doorway, gripping his favorite stuffed bear, a worn-out toy his mother had given him for comfort. But no toy in the world could fill the emptiness inside him at that moment. Jason didn't even look back. His suitcase was packed, his car was running, and his decision was final. "Dad?" Oliver's voice trembled as he took a step forward. His small hands reached out, desperate for even a single glance of reassurance. "Where are you going? When are you coming back?" Jason paused, his shoulders stiff, but he didn't turn around. He exhaled sharply, as if Oliver's words were a weight he didn't want to carry. Without facing his son, he muttered under his breath, "I can't do this anymore." Sarah, Oliver's mother, rushed to her son's side, wrapping her arms around him protectively. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, her heart breaking as she watched the man she once loved walk away without hesitation. "Jason, please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "He's your son. He needs you." Jason finally turned, but not to look at Oliver. He looked straight at Sarah, his expression cold, almost resentful. "I never wanted this," he spat. "I never wanted a child who can't even be normal. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to have a son who melts down in public? Who can't even hold a proper conversation? I can't take it anymore." Oliver flinched at his father's words, his small fingers clutching tighter onto Sarah's dress. He didn't fully understand why his dad was leaving, but he understood one thing. He wasn't good enough for him. Jason adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and without another word, stepped into his car. The engine roared to life, and just like that, he was gone. Oliver let out a shaky breath, his lips quivering as he whispered, "Is Daddy ever coming back?" Sarah couldn't answer, because deep down, she already knew the truth. But what Jason didn't know was that fate had something brutal in store for him. This is the story of a father who abandoned his autistic son, thinking he was a burden. He thought walking away would make his life easier, that without Oliver, his problems would disappear. But what happened next? He would soon learn that life has a way of making people pay for their mistakes. That no matter how far you run, you can't escape karma. Because one day, the same child he rejected would become everything he could have been proud of. And when Jason finally realized what he had lost, it would already be too late. At just 6 years old, Oliver is a boy full of wonder. He sees the world differently from most kids his age. His bright brown eyes are always scanning his surroundings, searching for patterns that others don't notice. The cracks on the pavement, the rhythm of raindrops on the window, the way the numbers on a clock align at certain times. All of it fascinates him. Numbers, in particular, bring him comfort. While other kids play with action figures or race their toy cars, Oliver prefers lining up building blocks in sequences that follow an exact mathematical pattern. But Oliver also struggles in ways that make everyday life difficult. He doesn't like loud noises. The sudden honk of a car or the clatter of dishes can make him cover his ears and shut down. He has trouble expressing himself in words, often speaking in short, carefully chosen sentences or repeating phrases he's heard before. When he's overwhelmed, he rocks back and forth, his fingers tapping against his leg in a rhythm only he understands. Despite his struggles, Oliver is incredibly loving. He adores his mother, clinging to her whenever he feels anxious. He longs for his father's approval, though Jason rarely offers it. Every time Jason comes home from work, Oliver hesitantly approaches, gripping his favorite stuffed bear in one hand. "Dad, I learned a new number pattern today," he'd say softly, only to receive a distracted nod in return. Oliver doesn't fully understand why his father seems distant, but deep down, he senses it. He knows he's different, and he fears that's the reason why his dad doesn't love him the same way his mom does. Jason Carter is a man who has built his life on discipline, ambition, and an obsession with success. Tall, well-groomed, and always dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, he commands attention wherever he goes. He's a senior executive at a high-powered investment firm, where results matter more than emotions. Everything in his world is measured in wins and losses, and he sees himself as a winner, someone who has fought for everything he has. To Jason, image is everything. His house is immaculate, his car is spotless, and his reputation in the corporate world is untouchable. He believes in control, order, and perfection. And unfortunately, he sees Oliver as the one thing in his life that doesn't fit that mold. From the moment Oliver was diagnosed with autism, Jason struggled to accept it. At first, he convinced himself it was just a phase, something Oliver would grow out of. But as the years passed and Oliver's behaviors became more apparent, his struggles with social interaction, his sensitivity to sounds, his difficulty with eye contact, Jason felt more and more embarrassed. He hated the stares they got in public when Oliver had a meltdown. He hated explaining to his colleagues why his son wasn't like other kids. And most of all, he hated the idea that his child, the person meant to carry on his legacy, wasn't the son he had envisioned. Instead of trying to understand Oliver, Jason distanced himself. He poured more hours into work, staying late at the office, taking weekend business trips, and leaving Sarah to handle their son alone. He rarely attended school meetings, never joined therapy sessions, and avoided one-on-one time with Oliver. To the outside world, Jason was the picture of success. But at home, he was a stranger to his own son. Sarah Carter is the opposite of Jason in almost every way. Where Jason is cold and distant, Sarah is warm and nurturing. Where Jason sees Oliver's autism as a burden, Sarah sees it as part of what makes her son unique. From the moment Oliver was born, Sarah knew he was special. She noticed early on how he fixated on patterns, how he was drawn to numbers, how he expressed love in small, quiet ways, by pressing his forehead against hers or tracing shapes on her palm with his finger. She never saw him as different in a bad way. To her, Oliver was simply Oliver. But life as a mother to a child with autism hasn't been easy. Sarah has spent countless nights researching therapies, fighting for school accommodations, and learning how to support Oliver through his struggles. She's patient when he has meltdowns, gently guiding him through the storm instead of punishing him. She speaks to him in ways that make him feel safe, never forcing him to make eye contact or expecting him to communicate like other kids. But the hardest part of her journey hasn't been Oliver's autism. It's been doing it alone. Jason's emotional distance has been the biggest challenge. At first, Sarah tried to make him understand. She begged him to come to Oliver's therapy appointments. She showed him research, hoping he'd see that their son wasn't broken, just different. But Jason never listened. He dismissed her concerns, called her too emotional, and told her she was making excuses for Oliver's behavior. Over time, Sarah stopped trying to change Jason's mind. Instead, she focused on being the mother Oliver needed. But deep down, she knows one painful truth. Jason's absence is hurting their son more than he realizes. And no matter how much love she gives Oliver, she can't fill the void of a father who refuses to accept his own child. As the days passed, Jason's sense of unease and frustration began to fester. What had once been a subtle discomfort, a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, grew stronger and more difficult to ignore. Oliver's behavior, his seemingly endless struggle with communication, and his inability to process the world in a way that Jason could understand, became a source of embarrassment. The smallest things, which once might have gone unnoticed, began to rub Jason the wrong way. Oliver's loud, disjointed speech, his unpredictable reactions to everyday situations, and the way people in public stared when he acted out. To Jason, it felt like his son was a constant reminder of his failure to maintain the perfect life he had so carefully constructed, the perfect life he believed he was entitled to. At work, things were no better. Jason, always obsessed with appearances and maintaining the image of success, started avoiding any mention of his son. He was often asked about his family at business meetings or social gatherings, but when it came time to talk about his home life, Jason would quickly shift the conversation to something else, his achievements at work, his upcoming business ventures, or the latest development in his career. Oliver's name became a taboo subject. Each time someone casually mentioned children or family, Jason's heart would race, his palms would sweat, and he would steer the conversation away before anyone could dig deeper. It wasn't that he didn't love Oliver, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his son was somehow beneath him, a reflection of his own shortcomings. The tension reached a boiling point one evening at a restaurant. The family had gone out for a quiet dinner, hoping for a peaceful night out, But Oliver's anxiety was on full display. The lights of the restaurant, the noise of the bustling crowd, and the unfamiliar smells overwhelmed him. He began to fidget in his seat, his hands twitching, and soon enough, he started to make soft whimpering noises. As the situation escalated, his frustration turned into a full-blown meltdown. He began to shout, flapping his hands in a desperate attempt to regain control. Other diners looked on, some whispering, some even casting judgmental glances. Jason's face flushed red with embarrassment. He could feel the weight of the stares pressing down on him. It was as if the entire restaurant was watching him, silently judging him for not being able to control his own son. He looked at Sarah, who was desperately trying to calm Oliver, speaking to him in soothing tones and holding his hands, but it wasn't enough. The more Sarah tried to comfort Oliver, the more agitated he became. Jason's patience, which had been wearing thin for months, snapped. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table as he watched Sarah struggle. He had had enough. This wasn't how he had imagined his life would turn out. Finally, Jason could no longer keep his feelings inside. His voice, tight with anger and frustration, cut through the restaurant's clatter. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," he shouted, his words sharp and cutting. "He's not normal. I didn't sign up for this." The entire table went silent, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The weight of his words hung in the air like a thick fog. He could see the hurt flash in Sarah's eyes, but he didn't care. In that moment, all he felt was his own overwhelming discomfort, his sense of failure, and the anger that had been building for so long. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to calm Oliver, who was still crying uncontrollably. She had heard Jason's harsh words, and they stung, but she kept her composure. She knew her son wasn't a burden. He was her child, her precious boy, and she would fight for him no matter what. But Jason? She wasn't sure if he still cared. He was so caught up in his own image, his career, and the perfect life he wanted to project that he had forgotten what truly mattered. With the tension escalating, Jason stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm done," he said coldly, turning his back on his family. "You have a choice, Sarah. Either send Oliver to a special facility where he can get the help he needs, or I'm leaving. I'm not living like this anymore." His voice was final, as if he had already made up his mind. He didn't look back as he grabbed his coat and stormed out of the restaurant. Sarah sat there, frozen, her eyes wide in disbelief. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. How could Jason abandon their son like that? How could he see Oliver as something to be fixed instead of loved? Her heart shattered as she looked at Oliver, whose sobs had quieted into soft whimpers. She wanted to scream, to beg Jason to stay, to make him understand that their son wasn't a burden but a blessing. But it was too late. Jason had made his choice. Later that night, after they returned home in silence, Jason didn't even bother to speak to Sarah. He grabbed his suitcase and packed his things with a cold, mechanical precision. He didn't want to be a part of this family anymore, not if it meant dealing with a son he could no longer ignore or fix. "I'm leaving," he said bluntly, his words final. There was no emotion in his voice, only a hard, indifferent tone. "You figure it out. I'm done." And with that, Jason walked out of their home, leaving Sarah and Oliver in the silence of the night. As the door slammed behind him, Sarah sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She held Oliver tightly, whispering soothing words into his ear, but the emptiness that filled the house was deafening. Jason had made his decision, and there was no turning back. Months passed since Jason walked out, leaving Sarah and Oliver to navigate a life filled with uncertainty and pain. At first, Sarah was paralyzed by the weight of what had just happened. Jason's departure left a hole in their lives that couldn't easily be filled, and Sarah had to come to terms with the fact that the man she had once loved and believed in no longer cared for them. The grief was overwhelming, but the thought of Oliver, her precious son, kept her going. She couldn't afford to let him see her despair. She had to be strong for him, even when everything inside her was breaking. Sarah worked tirelessly to provide for Oliver. She took on multiple jobs, anything that would help pay the bills, keep food on the table, and offer Oliver the support he needed. Some days, she barely slept. She worked as a waitress during the day, cleaning offices at night, and on weekends, she picked up extra shifts as a retail assistant. All of it was exhausting, but Sarah knew she had no choice. There was no time to wallow in sorrow. There was no one else to help them. As she juggled all her responsibilities, she made sure to keep up with Oliver's therapy and special needs programs, doing everything she could to ensure he felt loved and supported despite their financial strain. But as the months wore on, something extraordinary began to happen. Oliver's brilliance, which had always been a subtle spark in his mind, started to grow. Though he had always struggled with communication, he had an innate ability to see patterns that no one else could. He began solving complex math problems that other children his age couldn't even begin to comprehend. His mind was like a finely tuned machine, working in a way that amazed everyone who saw it. But what truly set him apart was his ability to predict stock market patterns, a talent that came seemingly out of nowhere. At first, Sarah didn't understand the full scope of Oliver's abilities. She noticed him scribbling numbers and equations all over his notebooks, but it wasn't until she started researching the patterns he was predicting that she realized something incredible was happening. Her son was able to predict the rise and fall of stock prices with an accuracy that could only be described as genius level. She was stunned, unsure of what to do with this gift he had, but she knew it was something special. One afternoon, Sarah decided to take a chance. She contacted a tech company that specialized in data analytics, explaining what Oliver had been doing and offering to send them some of his predictions. The company was initially skeptical, but when they saw the results for themselves, they were floored. Oliver's mind was a gold mine, and they immediately offered him a scholarship to an elite academy for gifted children. At just 10 years old, Oliver was about to step into a world of opportunity that most adults could only dream of. As Oliver began his education at the academy, Sarah watched with a mixture of pride and relief. She knew the road had been hard, but she also knew that her sacrifice was worth it. She had raised a son whose potential was limitless. Oliver thrived in his new environment, his natural gifts being nurtured and honed by experts in the field. He made friends with other brilliant kids, his quiet demeanor and unique way of thinking setting him apart even among his gifted peers. He was no longer the troubled child that Jason had been so ashamed of. Instead, he was a rising star, and the world was beginning to take notice. Meanwhile, Jason's life was spiraling out of control. His arrogance, the very thing that had once made him so successful, was now his undoing. He refused to listen to his advisors, believing he knew better than anyone else. His investments, once thriving, began to falter as he poured money into bad ventures. He had always been obsessed with image and success, but now his empire was crumbling. The business that had once been the envy of his peers started to collapse under the weight of his poor decisions. The market turned against him, and investors began pulling out, sensing that Jason's judgment was no longer reliable. As Jason's financial situation worsened, his once promising career turned to dust. He found himself unable to maintain the lavish lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. His company was forced to declare bankruptcy, and Jason had no choice but to sell off his assets, including the luxury house he had once been so proud of. His pride and refusal to seek help or admit his mistakes had led him down a path of ruin. The man who had once looked down on his son for being broken was now a shadow of his former self, consumed by regret and shame. And then, the final twist of fate arrived. Jason was approached by the very same tech company that had given Oliver his scholarship. They had discovered that the financial troubles Jason had faced were not isolated incidents. His investments had led to a string of bad decisions, ones that had severely impacted the stock market in ways he hadn't realized. They demanded that he pay restitution for the damage he had caused, but it was too late. Jason had nothing left. His life, once filled with opulence and power, had been reduced to ashes. The arrogance that had once defined him had led him to ignore the one thing that mattered most: people. In his pursuit of wealth and success, he had lost everything: his family, his career, and his dignity. As Sarah watched Oliver excel, and Jason's life continued to unravel, she couldn't help but think back to the moment when Jason had walked out on them. It was in that moment of abandonment that she had realized her true strength. She had fought for Oliver when no one else would, and now, The universe was showing her that hard work and love could lead to triumph. Jason had underestimated her, and he had underestimated Oliver. But karma had a way of setting things right. Jason's downfall wasn't just the result of bad business decisions. It was the universe's way of telling him that you cannot abandon your own blood, your own flesh and soul, and expect to walk away unscathed. As Oliver thrived, Jason faced the consequences of his actions. What goes around truly does come around. The months that followed Jason's departure from his family were a blur of reckless decisions and mounting regret. His business, which he had once held with such pride, began to crumble. He had been too blinded by his own arrogance to see the warning signs of impending failure. Every bad investment, every decision made in pursuit of personal gain rather than the well-being of his company, had finally caught up with him. The stock market crashes, the failed partnerships, and the poor judgment calls piled up, each one more destructive than the last. Jason found himself scrambling to salvage what little remained of his empire. He called in every favor he could think of, reaching out to old business contacts, hoping for a lifeline. But one by one, they turned their backs on him. The once powerful man who had commanded respect and admiration was now a shadow of his former self. The humiliation of rejection stung more than the loss of money. Jason had always prided himself on his connections, his ability to control every situation. But now, he was powerless. Soon, the inevitable came. His company filed for bankruptcy, and his home, his symbol of success, was repossessed by the bank. The luxury estate that had once been his pride, a mansion complete with sprawling lawns and opulent furniture, was now nothing more than a distant memory. As Jason stood in the empty house, the echo of his past life rang in his ears. His business, his reputation, and the wealth that had defined him were gone, swept away by the very arrogance that had led him to abandon his son. Homeless, broke, and with nowhere to turn, Jason wandered the streets, his mind reeling with self-pity. He was a man who had once believed he could control the world, and now he was left with nothing but the cold, unforgiving reality of his failures. Desperation took hold, and with each passing day, he sank deeper into the abyss. He had alienated everyone who once respected him, and now he was utterly alone. One afternoon, as Jason wandered the streets of a city that had once admired him, he spotted a large banner hanging outside a grand hotel. It read, "Charity Event for Autistic Children." A night of celebration. Jason paused for a moment, his curiosity piqued. Despite everything that had happened to him, he couldn't help but feel a pull toward the event. It was a reminder of the life he had so easily discarded, the son he had rejected. He hadn't spoken to Sarah or Oliver in months, but the image of Oliver's face, tear-streaked and confused, was still burned into his mind. Jason remembered how he had looked at his son with disgust when he was younger, dismissing his gifts as mere quirks, seeing his disability as a problem to be solved rather than a part of who Oliver was. In his desperation, Jason thought that maybe, just maybe, attending the event would offer him some solace, a chance to face the ghosts of his past. With little more than the clothes on his back and the remnants of his pride, Jason entered the hotel. The atmosphere inside was warm, filled with an air of celebration. Tables were adorned with flowers, and the sound of laughter and chatter filled the room. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place, an outsider in a room full of people who seemed to be thriving while he was falling apart. He felt small, insignificant. As he wandered through the event, trying to make himself invisible, he saw a group of children being led onto the stage. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Oliver, now 10 years old, standing proudly at the center of the group. But this was not the timid, awkward child Jason had abandoned. This was a different boy, confident, intelligent, and surrounded by adoring smiles. Oliver was being hailed as a genius, his unique mind recognized and celebrated. Jason's heart clenched as he realized the truth. His son, the boy he had thought of as a burden, had become the person Jason had never been. Successful, respected, and loved. Oliver's special abilities, his brilliance with numbers, his uncanny ability to predict patterns, had garnered the attention of the tech industry. He had earned a scholarship to a prestigious academy, and his talent was now the stuff of legends. But Jason had never been there to see it. He had turned his back on Oliver when he needed him most, and now his son was being celebrated as the guest of honor at this event. Jason could only watch from the sidelines, a spectator in the story of his son's success. The final blow came when the host of the event took the microphone, announcing, "Tonight, we honor the incredible accomplishments of young Oliver, our guest of honor. His ability to solve complex problems has opened doors for children like him all over the world. We believe in his potential to change the future." Jason stood there, stunned, as the audience erupted into applause. His son, the boy he had abandoned, was now a symbol of hope and achievement. The realization hit Jason like a ton of bricks. He had lost everything, not just his wealth, his status, and his reputation, but the love and respect of the one person who could have forgiven him. The son he had rejected had turned out to be everything Jason was not: humble, brilliant, and, most of all, successful in a way Jason had never been. As the event continued, Jason felt the sting of his decisions like never before. He had thought he was justified in leaving Oliver behind, thinking that his son's disability was a hindrance to his own life. But now, as he watched Oliver being celebrated, he understood that he had been the one who was truly disabled all along, unable to see the true value of his son and unable to recognize the gifts that had been right in front of him. Karma, it seemed, had a way of delivering its message with devastating precision. Jason had abandoned his son, but in the end, it was he who had been abandoned by the very life he had sought to build. His pursuit of perfection and status had led him to make the worst decision of his life. And now, as he stood in the shadows of Oliver's success, Jason realized that he would never be able to undo the damage he had caused. In that moment, Jason was forced to confront the truth. His pride, his arrogance, and his failure to understand the value of his own son had cost him everything. And as Oliver's brilliance shone brighter than ever, Jason was left to wrestle with the consequences of his choices, alone, ashamed, and with nothing left to call his own. Karma had indeed struck hard, and it had delivered the ultimate payback. Jason stood at the entrance of the charity hall, his steps hesitant and slow, the weight of the past few years bearing down on him. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a heavy shroud. He had lost everything: his business, his wealth, his self-worth. His only remaining hope was to find a way back into the life he had once turned his back on. He spotted Oliver on the stage, the boy he had abandoned, the one he had once considered a burden, now standing tall as a genius. His heart twisted with a mixture of guilt and pride, but mostly regret. He had hoped for this moment, his son's success, but never in a million years had he imagined that the very thing he had pushed away would be the source of his own undoing. Pushing through the crowd of admirers, Jason made his way toward Oliver, each step filled with the crushing weight of his past mistakes. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He had once been at the top, and now he was nothing. When he finally reached Oliver, the boy was standing with Sarah, his mother. They were surrounded by people praising him, admiring him for his achievements, but it was his mother who held Oliver's gaze, protectively standing in front of him, as if daring anyone to come too close. Jason's voice trembled as he whispered, "Son, I made a mistake. Can you forgive me?" He felt the words leaving his mouth, a desperate plea for redemption. He could hardly believe he was speaking them, the apology he had never imagined he would need to say. But Oliver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his eyes toward his father, his expression calm yet resolute. There was no anger, no hatred, only a quiet, firm resolution. The boy looked at Jason, as if seeing him for the first time, and said simply, "You left me when I needed you most. Now, I don't need you." Jason's heart sank. The words cut deeper than any financial loss or business failure ever could. His own son, his flesh and blood, had just told him that he was no longer needed. In that moment, Jason realized that forgiveness wasn't something Oliver owed him. It was something Jason had to earn, and it was something he may never get. Before Jason could react, Sarah stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "You walked away once, Jason. Stay gone," she said, her eyes burning with the anger of a woman who had fought for years to protect her son from the man who had abandoned them both. She didn't need to say more. Her words carried the weight of everything Jason had done and failed to do. Jason stood there, utterly frozen, as security began to approach, sensing the tension in the air. His presence was no longer welcome. He was no longer a part of this world, this family, this life that he had thrown away so carelessly. Without another word, security guided Jason toward the door, their hands firm but respectful. As he walked away, a silence hung heavy in the air. The man who had once had everything was now escorted out of the very place where his son, the boy he had once deemed a failure, was now being celebrated. Jason's shoulders slumped, his pride shattered, his world smaller than it had ever been. The family he had abandoned had moved on without him, and he was left to face the full weight of his decisions. His regret was palpable, but it was too late. Oliver and Sarah stood together, side by side. There was no need for more words. The past had been written, and there was no going back. Jason thought he was walking away from a burden, but in reality, he was walking away from the greatest blessing of his life. The son he once rejected, the one he thought was too imperfect, became everything he could have been proud of. His genius, his resilience, and the way he rose above it all. Oliver had become someone Jason could never have imagined. But by the time Jason realized his mistake, it was far too late. Never turn your back on those who need you most. Because one day, you might turn around and realize they don't need you anymore.